We are joined tonight by Dr. Stephen Rabe, who has come to us virtually from his, from actually locally, happens to be within 10 minutes or so of the museum, I think, or 15 minutes from the museum. But normally he was a professor at University of Texas, Dallas. He received a Ph.D. from the University of Connecticut. And since retiring in 2017 or 19?
2017, John.
17.
Say, go Huskies for the Yukon, the epicenter of the basketball world.
There you go. So he has, this is the second book since retiring. And just to give you guys a little scale of how well received this book is, this was published by Cambridge, which is an academic press, which is a different publishing model than most commercial presses. But the book has so far sold about 20,000 copies. It's in very high demand from the publisher and on book sites, and is reviewed incredibly well. So again, Steve, thanks for being with us, and we're glad you're here.
Thank you very much, and it's a great privilege, and I can see from the chat line that people are listening from all over the United States, so that makes me very happy.
Good, good. Well, we're glad you're with us. All right, why don't we start out, Steve, and I think you do a better job than I would of just giving us maybe a thumbnail overview that this was part of D-Day. This was an airborne unit parachuting in, and why don't you just kind of show us where the book's going before we go back and hit the major details.
Sure. Most everyone who knows a little bit about D-Day history, and particularly the paratroopers, the 82nd Airborne, and the 101st, know that most of the paratroopers landed off target. There was intense flak, there was bad weather, etc., and the paratroopers were not quite where they expected to be. What we're writing here about in the Lost Paratroopers of Normandy is the group of paratroopers who were the most off target. 9 sticks or 9 airplanes of the 82nd Airborne landed near the village of Gren, about 20 miles off target. Another stick of the 101st Airborne landed also near the village of Gren, which is a small village of about 900 people just south of the port town of Karata. And then a glider plane of the 82nd Airborne also landed near the village of Gren, plopped into the Marais or the marshes. So ultimately, there are about 165 paratroopers, mainly from the 82nd Airborne, who are way, way off target. And the question then became what to do. The paratroopers landed in swampland that is naturally kind of flooded in the winter months, but also the Germans had backed up the rivers, and so several of the paratroopers drowned. There is at the village of Gren, the landmark is a church, a Romanesque church from the 12th century that is about 50 meters higher than the surrounding land. The paratroopers made their way there. And then the question was what to do. And the debate was whether they should try to get back some 20 miles from where they had landed, or should they stay? Now, this was a headquarters company, by and large. It was a support company for the 3 other infantry companies. They had 81 millimeter mortars, they had light machine guns. And so part of the officer corps argued that they should try to get back and support the infantry companies. The problem was they were 20 miles away. They wouldn't be able to carry their 81 millimeter mortars. Several of the men couldn't swim. It would be going through the Marais, through the marshes, and it seemed not particularly feasible. The commanding officer, the executive officer of the battalion, ruled that they should stay and wait for men from Omaha Beach to make their way, to wait for the invaders coming in from land to reach them. And what they should do is simply stay in the village. Now, in making this decision, and this is the key thing, the major general who made the major who made the decision was encouraged dramatically by the people of the village of Gren. Now, Gren is a village, as I said, of 900 people. It was an unoccupied village. Surrounding them are Germans everywhere, but the village itself was unoccupied. The villagers asked the paratroopers to stay and protect them. And beyond asking, without any prompting from the paratroopers, they went out into the Marais in their canal boats. They began to recover all the parapacks with all of the equipment, including the 81mm mortars, 5 machine guns, the medical equipment, the communications equipment, all of the ammunition. In addition, they pledged to support the paratroopers. They had a meeting in the church and all the men unanimously voted to support the paratroopers. In addition, the women of the village organized themselves to cook twice a day for the paratroopers so they would have food. This included women in the village going into occupied villages, purchasing supplies, and surreptitiously passing Nazi guards. Often they would hide their food in their wagons underneath straw and make it to the village. And so the villagers supported the paratroopers 100% and encouraged them to stay. Over the next several days, it seemed the plan was working. By June 9th, two infantrymen from Omaha Beach had actually wandered into the village, suggesting that infantrymen were getting close from Omaha Beach from the 29th Infantry. At that particular time also, the people of the village went out on reconnaissance missions with the paratroopers. They were so eager and so anti-German that they actually wanted to carry arms, but the paratroopers discouraged them. And in addition, there began to be quite strong bonding between the villagers and the paratroopers. Children would bring the food out to the paratroopers who had dug in around the village and then made a perimeter. Now, everything was going pretty well until about June 9th, June 10th. Unbeknownst to the paratroopers, on June 6th, a brand new Waffen-SS division, about 250 miles south of the village of Gren, had been given the orders to move towards Keratah, the port town that bisected the landing beaches of Utah and Omaha Beach. And they were heading, and Gren was right in the way. And there began to be contact between the Waffen-SS, an entire division, and the paratroopers on June 10th. And then on June 11th, there was an attack by first a German force, a German military force that were not the Waffen-SS, and then 2 major attacks on the afternoon and evening of Sunday, June 11th. The paratroopers ran out of ammunition and had to withdraw. They took casualties. The Waffen-SS moved into the town. Any paratrooper they captured, they executed. They ultimately executed about 20 paratroopers, about 30 paratroopers died from military wounds. Despite this, and also murdering some of the villagers kept faith with the paratroopers. Ultimately, about 110 escaped. Many escaped in one large group in which they were given reconnaissance, food, and aid by villagers and others in the surrounding villagers, and another 20 were hidden in a barn for 3 days by a friendly village family, and ultimately also made it to safety. So ultimately, the people of Gren saved about 110 paratroopers of the original 165 or so. In addition, what's also about the story is the villagers never lost their loyalty. They never once ever called them anything but our liberators, our paras. Their entire village was ultimately torched by the Germans. The people were forced into exile. The village of Gren was the most destroyed village in all of Normandy, and they never regretted anything they ever did. And so then these 110 men that the villagers saved ultimately participated in the Normandy campaign. They were in the Battle of the Bulge. They jumped over the Rhine River, and in some cases did occupation duty in Berlin. In addition, by delaying the Waffen-SS, both the villagers and the paratroopers helped save the critical port town of Keratah by delaying and slowing down the attack. So that, in a nutshell, is what happened. But I'd put it in one sentence. Ordinary people did extraordinary things. And why did they do it? Ultimately, when you press them, they did it for life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. They did it for liberty, equality, and fraternity.
Thank you. And Steve, I normally always ask the authors what made them want to write the book that they came out with, but in your situation, you have a very special reason and connection with this story. So can you tell us about that before we move on?
Sure. The question, as I said to you earlier today, John, could be turned around and asking me, why did I wait 60 years to write this book? Or why I received my Ph.D. in 1977, why did I wait from 1977, since 1977, when I was a professional historian, to write this book? The reason is my father is one of the last lost paratroopers. My father ultimately became Staff Sergeant Rabe. He was a mortar man, and he was one of the paratroopers who landed near the village of Grant. He was one of the 21 who was hidden in the barn by a family called the Rabe family. Now, I had known about this. My father was very unusual in that most veterans of World War II did not talk about the war until later in life, into their 60s. My father was kind of a reversal. He talked a lot in his 20s and 30s, and then by his 40s, he wasn't talking about the war at all and was beginning to suffer some forms of PTSD. He would let me listen in when my three uncles would ask him questions. My three uncles were veterans of World War II, but they had not participated in combat. He would let me listen in when my uncles would ask him questions. He also took me to reunions, so I learned some stories. I learned that he had been hidden in a barn for 3 days while surrounded by Germans by a friendly French family. He told me about how hungry he was, even ravenous, and that his hunger had ultimately been met by the fact that the farm family delivered surreptitiously boiled cabbage with butter. And he would always say that was the best meal he'd ever had. And if either I, my brother, or my sister wasn't eating their meals that our mother cooked for us, he would remind us of how hungry he had once been and how wonderful this meal had been. So I'd known about this story, although I didn't know all the details, all the kind of enormous amounts of contributions by the people of the village of Grant. And so once I was just on the academic carousel. I got to be a full professor very quickly. I got to have an endowed chair. I could go to conferences around the world. I was writing a lot of other books, and this is my 13th book. So it was only after I got off the academic carousel, which was quite pleasant, that I finally had the time to write this book, something I had known about and had been gradually collecting information over 40 years. But I really wish I had started long, long ago, because by the time I got around to it, most of the paratroopers and most of the villagers had perished. But there was an enormous amount of material. And so I was able to do that. And I was also able to use my skills as an historian to go into French archives, German archives, American archives, and get a total perspective. And I'd also like to give a shout out to my wife, because I don't read German, but she was able to translate the German documents for me. So we have a perspective of the Waffen SS, we have the perspective of the villagers, and we have the perspective of the paratroopers.
So before we move on, for those of our audience members who might not be familiar with this, can you tell us what's different about a Waffen SS unit as opposed to a Wehrmacht unit, and what made that such a danger to have them in the area?
Good. Excellent question, John. The Waffen, this is the 17th Waffen SS. These are SS officers. To quote from John Mal, to quote from Stephen Remy, who's written a book about the Malmedy massacre during the Battle of Bulge. The Waffen SS fought terror war. They weren't just seeking conquest of land or defeat of other armies. They were seeking to install terror. When the Waffen SS came into the village of Grant, the first thing they did was find the wounded people, badly wounded people, the paratroopers. They bayoneted them, forced them into a pond, some of them still living. Then they marched other men a couple miles away, forced them to dig their own graves, shot them in the back of the head, and then just buried them in a foot, etc. Then they killed the priest and his acolyte because they had committed the crime of carrying out the dictum of Christ and tending to the wounded paratroopers. They murdered the two housekeepers. They lined up 40 people and said, who's been cooperating with the paratroopers? Amazingly, the people of this village would not break. Indeed, some of them, and particularly the woman, just sassed them, saying, look what you are doing to our village. How can you be doing this? You have destroyed our church. You're destroying our buildings. You destroyed our school. And ultimately, they seem to have been taken back by this and did not kill any villagers. But what's different about the Waffen-SS as opposed to a regular German army, and I have all kinds of quotations when even Germans see Americans murdered, they say, well, it must have been the work of the SS. They have a taste for this, is that they fought terror war. They were seeking to inflict terror beyond simply conquest of land and defeat of other armies, etc. And it certainly took place in the village of Gren.
Remind us of what unit we're talking about here that your father was in.
This was headquarters company of the 3rd Battalion of the 507th Regiment. The 507th Regiment was a green paratrooper unit that had been formulated in the United States. They had trained in Alliance, Nebraska, had crossed the Atlantic in December of 1943, trained for a while in Northern Ireland near Portrush, then trained near Nottingham in England, and then had been the last of the 6 regiments of paratroopers from the 101st and 82nd. They were the last to land, and as they often said, the Germans were ready when they landed. They faced an enormous amount of headwind, and the casualty rate of the 507th in Normandy was just staggering. 2,004 men jumped on D-Day. About 750 were able to get back on a boat back to England some 6-7 weeks later. I mean, 2/3, 60% casualty rate.
So when they were that far off of their landing zone that they had planned to go to, were their higher headquarters aware of this? Was there an attempt to get to them and rescue them?
Another excellent question, John. First off, no one, now 78 years later, 79 years later, no one knows why they're so off course. The number 2 officer, Captain Dave Brummett, wrote in 1999, I've been trying to figure out for 55 years why we're so far off course, and I still don't know why. They were terribly off course, just terribly off course. Now, once they're off course, did they try to make communication with their unit, the 82nd Airborne headquarters? Yes, they did. It's kind of humorous. They jumped with 2 pigeons, and they put a message on one of the pigeons and sent the pigeon, hopefully finding headquarters. Well, actually, headquarters found the dead pigeon. Apparently, the Germans shot the pigeon out of the sky, but they found the pigeon. They found the message, and they sent out a message to any units in the area, please help these men. But they're so far off course as a group that no one can help them. You can find in the history of D-Day of individuals who are farther off course, but not so many men, not such a group. In terms of the second pigeon, as the attack came on June 10th and then on Sunday, June 11th, the pigeon was making a lot of noise, so the pigeon was sacrificed, unfortunately. So
I'm trying to imagine the civilians there and their the enthusiastic dedication they had to helping defend their village with the paratroopers. Do you think that was unusually high? And if so, why? Was the occupation by the Germans prior to D-Day so brutal that these folks just wanted to do something to fight back?
This is a real critical question. The former mayor of the village of Gren will proudly note this is the only village where 100% of the people resisted. During the years of occupation, a handful of French collaborated openly, a handful of French resisted, and most people tried to get on with their lives and probably in small ways collaborated. Okay. What's different here about this village of Gren of 900 people? One, it's a very old village. The church is from the 12th century. Some of the people could trace their ancestry 1,000 years. Virtually everyone is related to everyone else. If you visit the cemetery, there aren't that many names because everyone had intermarried. Everyone is Catholic. Everyone is some form of agricultural worker. All of those things are true. By and large, they tend to be politically conservative. This is an area where political conservatives were strong. The people tended to be religious. Now, there's some other things to consider. The men who met in the church on June 6, June 7 to consider aiding the paratroopers, they were middle-aged men. Most of them were veterans of World War I. Gustave Rigaud, who helps hide the paratroopers in his family barn, carries shrapnel in his knee from World War I. Many of them had sons who were prisoners of war in Germany. Many of them had younger sons who the Germans were trying to press into compulsory labor in 1943-44. That makes them angry. In addition, many of them are resisting or resenting the increasing rationing system. Things are going bad for the Germans. There's not enough food. They're taking more and more food away from the French. In terms of the Rigaud family, they have 2 family cows. It's very granular. They have 2 family cows, and they're stealing the product of one of the cows. This makes them extremely angry. A couple of other things here. This is an unoccupied town. So during the period of the occupation from 1940 to 44, people did have the ability to go to the local cafe and grouse about the Germans. That makes a difference, I think. Also, it was just so surprising to them in a town that many people described to me as, I thought I lived at the end of the earth. The whole area is flooded a good deal of the time. That all of a sudden 165 people are floating down around them. And here becomes another issue. On the 20th anniversary of 1964, the parish priest in a homily compared the paratroopers coming to the village of Gren to God sending his only son, Jesus, to earth. And, I don't want to exaggerate, but to many people, the coming of the paratroopers floating into their village, the end of the earth, was a sign from God to do something. So a whole variety of things come together, I think, that make this village unique and different. Now, the thing that I would like all your listeners to understand, however, maybe it seems almost fantasy land, etc., but it's true. And it's hard perhaps for us to believe in such a highly politically polarized time. When I ask people, why did you risk your life? I mean, this means certain execution, collaborating with the Allies, hiding people in a barn. The Rigaud family had a 2-year-old. He would have been murdered by the Nazis if the Nazis found this out. So why did you do it? Why did you do it? Why do you refer to them as our paras or as the liberators? And the first answer, they said, well, of course we'd aid them. Of course we would. They came to help us. How could we not help them? But in a larger sense, when I pressed deeper and deeper, they just simply said, well, we believe in liberty. We believe in equality. We believe in fraternity. I mean, they believed in the ideals. And implicitly, well, the paratroopers are tough guys and don't want to voice it much. They believed in life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So it seems to me all these sorts of things come together to make this village very unique. There is no other village like this, and there is no other situation like this. And as I like to say, if you buy my book and you read it, you'll feel better about humility. You really will, because here are people acting on principle on both sides, the American side and on the French side.
Steve, I thought what we could do now, rather than save a lot of the image to the end, let me ask Jen to bring up the slides again. We'll just go through maybe the first 4 or 5 because they pertain to what you've already talked about. I think it'd be good for folks who want to see these places.
And if we'd see number 13, the Silk from the Sky wedding picture, which is a good one to.
I thought maybe we could go. We could go back to that or here. Now, there's somebody in this
Right.
this image. Tell us about this.
These are paratroopers in May of 1944 in training in England. The man in the sweater is my father, and I just simply like to say about my father. I use the numbers 4, 3, 2 and 1, 4 Bronze Stars, 3 battlefield promotions, 2 Purple Hearts, and he left a toe in Belgium that was amputated because it was frozen during the Battle of the Bulge. He's got his hands on the shoulders of Arnold Martinez, excuse me, who unfortunately died at the village of Gren. To his right is Corporal Homer Poss, his good buddy, my father's good buddy, who was badly wounded in the days after the jump over the Rhine. But all of these men were at Gren, and except for Arnold Martinez, they all were saved by the villagers. Go to the next one.
All right, let's move on to the next one.
This is the leader of the 82nd, Major General James Gavin, who is beloved by the members of the 82nd because he was a general that would go out on patrol by himself and go on reconnaissance by himself. And there are endless stories of General Gavin just jumping into your foxhole, sharing his coffee, taking guard duty in at the foxhole, and then moving on. And he pretty much put his imprint on the 82nd Airborne and a particular emphasis on immense physical training. The idea was that paratroopers had to be like Olympic athletes. They had to be as fit as Joe Louis. They had to be as fit as Jesse Owens. The next one. This is the church before the Germans destroyed it. This is a Romanesque church from the 12th century. Of course, it demonstrates that the village of Gren had been there for 1,000 years.
Place. All right, let's see the next one.
This,
what do we
you can
see here?
This is a contemporary photo that I took, and it shows how low land it is. It's pretty much like Belgium. It's almost probably below sea level, and then 50 meters up is there the remnants of the church that was turned into a memorial. But you can see why the paratroopers, when they landed in the swamps there, that they just made their way to this higher ground. Go ahead.
Let's do one more here, Jim.
And here are there, of course, today there are canals, and ultimately the paratroopers would be able to escape Gren by going, particularly the 21, by going through canals. And if we could see number 13, the silk from the sky. Oh, here is one, of course, what happened to many paratroopers, dead paratroopers. About 5 paratroopers drowned on the morning of 6 June. The paratroopers landed at 2:38 a.m. near the village of Gren, and several became tangled in their parachutes and drowned. And this is Gustave Rigaud, a veteran of World War I, their little son Jean-Claude, and Madame Rigaud. In aiding the paratroopers, they were risking their life of their 2-year-old. Madame Bossier, often known as Mess Sergeant Bossier, she organized all the women of the village to engage in the 24-hour, 2 hot meals a day for the paratroopers. And when the SS came into her village, she just sassed them. Just amazing. She just sassed them and criticized them and yelled at them. Okay. This is Father Lebarchon, who was murdered by the SS. He had ministered to the wounded Americans. That was his crime. During World War I, he was a medic in the French army, so he was also a veteran. This is part of the church after the Germans bombarded it. This is the barn where my father hid. It doesn't look too formidable there, but it's actually quite long, and the loft itself is about 5 feet up there. And 21 men hid there in the Rigaud family barn for 3 days. Surrounded by the Waffen-SS. And this is my favorite picture. This is absolutely my favorite picture. This is the so-called silk from the sky. When the people of the village on June 6th and 7th went out into the Marais and retrieved all of the equipment, also the young woman retrieved the reserve parachutes. And there you see in the middle, Odette Rigaud, who is a member of the Rigaud family, and an older sister, Jean-Marie, who married in the silk made from the paratroopers' reserves parachutes. And within the Rigaud family today, which I have visited, they still have some of these dresses. And it was a kind of symbol in late 1945 of their continuing solidarity with the paratroopers. And though I didn't invent the phrase, I love the phrase, silk from the sky. And
Steve,
this was fairly common in Normandy for the women to get the reserve parachutes and make dresses out of them. I'm going to visit in a few days the little girl just to the right, who's sitting next to a very small girl. She was 12 years old, Margaret Rabe. But I love this photo, and in the Rabe family, they still have these dresses made from parachute silk, and it's kind of enduring, from their perspective, an enduring statement of support for the paratroopers. Okay.
Steve, had you visited this site at all before you started working on the book?
No, I just began more like a traditional historian, going through the archives, and then gradually did site research and interviewed people on site, and met Mark Rabe, who today is, we're going to see her, she's now 90, but with a great memory, and is actually quite famous in France and likes being famous. And I would tell your listeners that it's most amazing when you go into her house and you look on her mantle. She has a letter of thanks to the family from General Eisenhower. She has letters of commendation from Presidents Reagan and Obama. And she has her medal, her Distinguished Service Medal, which is the highest medal the Department of Army can give, which was given to her in 1988, because she and her sister Odette, right in the middle, they're the ones who found the 21 paratroopers hiding and brought them to the barn. And then they informed their parents that they had hidden 21 paratroopers.
Wow. Did your father or any of the other survivors visit the site?
My father died, unfortunately, at a very young age, at the age of 58. He was very much traumatized by PTSD, and there we saw a drowning paratrooper. At some point in his life, in his 40s, he became afraid of water. And he told my brother that every time he sees a body of water, he sees a drowning paratrooper. So that very much affected him, and affected, I think, shortened his life, the whole PTSD. Many of the men, when they retired, did return to the village of Gren. And it was rather interesting. Neither the villagers nor the paratroopers knew what happened to one another. The paratroopers had fighting at Normandy, they had the Battle of the Bulge, they had the jump of the Rhine River, and the people of the village had to reconstruct their lives. So both sides were wondering what had happened. But beginning in the 1980s, officers, people who were officers became career military people, and then many of the enlisted men began to return to the village, and there were a great deal of parties and celebration. Unfortunately, there's no one living now from the 507th Regiment, and none of the paratroopers who were at the village of Gren. And unfortunately, of all the villagers, including this family, only Mark there to the right, with the bows in her hair on the left and right, is alive. But yes, there was a great deal of reunion, but it took a long, long time. It took a long deal, and it was only when the officers themselves former officers began to investigate and do presentations to the U.S. Army that the proper celebrations took place in the mid-1980s. And there was a grand ceremony in 1986 when the Secretary of Army began awarding medals to 11 different people, some posthumously, who had helped the paratroopers.
All right, let's move on to the next slide. We have just a couple more here. I want to make sure we get to the one you were mentioning. Tell us about this, Steve. What is this we're looking at?
This is the memorial of the people who died, and there are a total of 50 paratroopers who died at the village of Gren. 30 from combat wounds. There were 3 assaults. One totally repelled the Germans on the morning of June 11th, but then the assaults by the Waffen-SS in the afternoon of June 11th, and then in the evening of June 11th. So about 30 people died from combat wounds, and another 20 were executed, including the battalion surgeon and several medics who were executed. All of these people were unarmed. Above are the numbers of villagers who died resisting the Germans over the period from 1940 to 45. So there's about 20 villagers died. So that was, again, a kind of cause of discontent among the villagers. so this is a memorial, and they preserve part of the church that was by and large destroyed.
All right, let's go on to the next one.
This is
the gentleman you mentioned earlier.
We saw the picture, Arnold Martinez. I believe that he was up in the belfry with the lieutenant who's directing the mortar fire when a long-range gun on the evening of June 11th hit the belfry and killed both the lieutenant and Arnold Martinez. His family was very influential in trying to keep alive the story of Gren. And I've been in close contact, and they were enormous aid to me. I would point out, in terms of finding things about the paratroopers who were there, once I began to contact people, remind them who my father was. And I think it helped a lot that I was a professional historian, one, and two, that my father had been there and some people remembered my father, etc. They were just so eager to tell about what had happened to their paratrooper at the village of Gren. And they knew the stories, and they could point me to other people, they could point me to sources, etc. And it even turns out, if you do things like find a grave, that people were posting things about their paratroopers on the obituaries of the men on the Find a Grave website. So Arnold, of course, is buried at the beautiful cemetery in Normandy, the American Cemetery. And I would tell anyone who's never been there to visit. It's an incredibly beautiful site. It's an incredibly staggeringly beautiful site. And you see most people weeping when they see it. It's so overwhelming to see the 9,000 crosses and stars of David.
Thank you. All right, let's I think there's a few more here. Jan, let's just sort of what tell us who these ladies are.
Right. This is Mart and Odette. Odette passed in 2019, to the left. She was 19 in 1944, and she described herself as a soldier of the resistance. And she was a piece of work. And that's her younger sister, Mart, who's still alive today. As we said, she's 90. We're going to visit her in about 2 weeks at her home. So she lives in Karatah. And these two women, when you ask them, they were always eager to talk. But again, when you ask them, why did you do it? They would just say, we believed in liberty. We believed in liberty. Do you have any regrets? No, none whatsoever. None whatsoever. What happened to the village? They had no regrets. They said, our father told us that liberty exacts a price. The defense of liberty exacts a price. I mean, it doesn't seem true, but it's true. It's true. This is what they believe.
All right, we have one more picture, and then we're going to get to the questions because we got a bunch of questions.
This is my wife. We're visiting Mart in her home, and there is that famous mantle behind with letters from Barack Obama, Ronald Reagan, Dwight Eisenhower, etc., and her own medal. And then, of course, she keeps scrapbooks, and people have come in, and she's a kind of delightful person. At that time, she was 80. This is 2019, so she's 86. She was an 86-year-old who loves being famous. And come D-Day, outside of our house is the BBC, is Reuters, the Associated Press, etc. And she just waves them in and takes their questions. So she's quite delightful. But as a 12-year-old, she pretty much followed the lead of her 19-year-old sister, to be sure. But she found paratroopers hiding and brought them to the family barn and helped feed them.
Okay, let's just keep this. Yeah, there we go. We'll get time. We're going to get to some questions here. For question one, will this be an audiobook?
It already is an audio. It's in audio. You can order it on audio. If you can order the title of the company starts with a T, but yes, it's an audiobook. It became an audiobook about a month ago.
Okay, great. Another question. Why were the paratroopers executed? This was a clear war crime.
It was a clear war crime of which no one paid any price for it. The person who supervised the murder of the 9 paratroopers, shooting them in the head, etc., actually became a POW and was at Fort Hutt here, close here in Virginia, close to the military museum, Army Military Museum, and he actually was wiretapped bragging about it. It was a clear war crime. Now, what was their rationalization? Their rationalization was that the paratroopers were using the church as a aiming point, in that the lieutenant and Private Martinez were up in the belfry guiding the mortarmen. And in the sacristy, the surgeon and the medics, of which there were a large number, there were 9 medics there because this was a headquarters company, were aiding wounded people. Their argument, or the argument of the man whose name was Fritz Svoboda, who was a squad leader in the Waffen-SS, was that they had violated the Geneva norms by using the church for military purposes, so that they, the Waffen-SS, had the right to murder people. Well, the logic that escapes me. And again, I tell you that the people who weren't ambulatory, they kept bayoneting and forced them into a nearby pond. Some of them were not dead when they were forced into the pond and then drowned.
Okay, in your research for the book, did you find that this village's situation was common throughout Normandy following the landings, or was it unique?
I think it's totally unique, not so much in that, if you read the account of Saint Marie Agli by the mayor, obviously large numbers of people in the surrounding area, including in the first liberated town, Saint Marie Agli, that large numbers of French aided the paratroopers. What I think is unique is the 100%. And what is particularly unique is the price that people paid in terms of aiding the paratroopers. There are a couple of other villages where they murdered 500-600 people, but there weren't Allied forces there. For whatever reason, the Waffen-SS was murdering people. But in the case here, you have the total collaboration of the town. I think it's probably fair to say a couple families left the village because they didn't want to be involved, but everyone cooperated. That makes it very unique. And I think that the end result of saving 110 paratroopers, and the thing that I'd like to again emphasize, the 110 paratroopers that they saved, for the most part, they made it all the way through the war. They participated in the Normandy campaign. They were at the Battle of the Bulge for 7 weeks. They jumped over the Rhine River, 7 weeks of Rhineland fighting. And these paratroopers also freed thousands upon thousands of slave laborers in the German factories in the Rhineland area. So what these people accomplished, what these villagers accomplished, did they know what they'd accomplished? No, not only if they read books after the war, is just very, very unique. And the total participation. And so I tried to explain, why is this village unique? And I think if there's any two things, it was that it was an unoccupied village, which gave people the opportunity to organize and grouse and get very angry. And two, that the just paratroopers appeared out of nowhere, unexpected, in a place that's very flooded, and people never expected to see this. And they perceive this, frankly, as a sign from God that they must act. They did, and they did.
Okay, how were the U.S. soldiers in the barn not found when surrounded by the SS looking for them?
Again, a very excellent question. Thank you for the question. A couple of times, German troops came close to the barn, and Madame Rigaud, the mother, went out and said, oh, don't come this way. You'll get your feet wet. Go over there and you'll keep your feet dry. And the Germans dutifully went the other way. Now, actually, two German soldiers and an officer actually entered the barn. The 21 men were aiming at these 3 guys. They're up in the loft and they were aiming. And one man pulled, T4 Eddie Page pulled his hand grenade. And as T4 Eddie Page said, just like us sometimes, the Germans go brick. The 3 Germans chose not to go up into the loft, because if they got on the loft, they would have been killed, but violence would have broken out. It would have been catastrophic for the family. And ultimately, the American paratroopers would probably have been caught. They didn't go out and they left. Then T480 Page was so nervous, he couldn't put his pin back into his grenade. And he had to call upon one of his buddies to put the pin back into the grenade. So it was just that one time. But the family was twice, I think, dissuaded Germans from marching close by the barn, saying, it's better if you're trying to go to the village. This barn is about 3 kilometers away from the village. If you want to get to the village quickly, go this way. And if you go that way, you're going to get your feet wet. So you don't want to do that. I mean, they're very shrewd. They were very shrewd. Very shrewd.
In retrospect, was Captain Brummett correct in insisting that the company move on to the Amfreville area, since that was, in fact, the 507th mission?
Well, certainly Captain Brummett believes so, right to the end. It's a very difficult issue. Major Johnston, who made the decision to stay, pointed out they would have to spike their 281 millimeter mortars, which was the main weapon of Headquarters Company. He was also worried, if they left on June 6th and 7th, there were Germans everywhere. They might have been trapped by the Germans. Captain Brummett was making the key point, which was that we have no artillery supporting us. We have no tanks. We have no air cover. We have no resupply. And he was also worried this was a Headquarters Company, not an infantry company. He would later concede that the Headquarters Company fought very well like an infantry company. So long-term, Captain Brummett seems correct, but you can't know if they had tried to get to Amfreville, which is west of St. Marie Glee and about 20 miles away. We can't know what they would have run into. It's a very difficult problem. After the second attack on the afternoon of June 11th, the officers met in the cafe. They drank some coffee and they discussed things. By this time, they were virtually out of ammunition. He would later become Colonel Naughton, but Lieutenant Naughton said it was discussed at that time about withdrawing, and that might have been a good time to withdraw. Major Johnston decided to stay and fight. Again, I think the thinking was the people had been so loyal to us, we can't abandon them. Now, when they had no ammunition, they had to withdraw. And essentially, they had no ammunition left. There were no mortars left. The machine gunners the 5 machine gunners had run out of ammunition. So, you could see that after the second attack, when they're virtually out of ammunition, perhaps they should have withdrawn. And certainly, Colonel Naughton thought maybe that was the time to withdraw. They were very much, as I said, were very much heartened by June 9th, the fact that 2 men from the 29th Infantry had actually made it to the village. How they had found the village of Gren, why they were by themselves, I'm not sure. It was a very difficult dilemma. I think probably sound military doctrine, and given they were a Headquarters Company, would have been that they should have tried some way or other to get back to their original mission.
Yeah.
But I mean, Major Johnston suffered a little bit in retrospect for his decision, but it is a defensible decision. It was a defensible decision, and there's no doubt in my mind that that decision was strengthened by the enthusiasm of the villagers, that they would protect them and that they would stay with them, and in fact, they kept their pledge. As I said, to potential readers, this story renews your faith in humanity.
We have one of our audience members asked, did you come across a paratrooper in your research named Broussard, the Cajun
yes.
that was KIA?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Yes. Sergeant Broussard spoke French, and the Cajun accent is very much like the Norman accent. He was the first person to arrive. He arrived on June 6th at the Rabe farm and knocked at the door and said, "We are friendly people." And they were shocked. The people were shocked to hear this French-speaking Sergeant Broussard. And in addition, Odette and Sergeant Broussard seemed to have had a certain affectation that developed over the next week. Sergeant Broussard was killed in the village of Gren. He had an idea near the end of dressing up in civilian clothes and trying to slip through the lines and see if he could find some help for the beleaguered paratroopers. But no, he's a key person, and he's the main contact between Major Johnston and the mayor of the village of Gren in terms of his ability to speak Cajun French. Sergeant Broussard was on the same plane as my father. He jumped, I think, number 2 or number 3, and my father jumped number 9 on that. Oh, yes.
All right. Well, before
one other thing, there's still a portrait of Sergeant Broussard on Marc Rigaud's mantle, because I think she knows that her older sister was sweet on him.
All right, we're gonna start to wrap up. Got one more question for Stephen Rabe, who's been with us in a fascinating program tonight. And this one's from me, thinking about your research, having read the book, but especially now that once we finally got the slides to work Sunday. But what did it feel? How did you feel when you went to all these locations, knowing how much research you had done? You've been spending so much time with the subject. Your father was there. What were your feelings about that time?
Well, I would just tell all of your listeners, it's an overwhelming experience to meet a person who made your grandson's life possible. It's an overwhelming experience. A person who saved your father's life, who made my life possible, and made my grandson's life possible. And other people have told me that when they met the Rigaud family, one woman said she just sobbed and sobbed. She couldn't talk to them. She just cried. So that was, that is the sense of why I've thrown myself into it. But I've also thrown myself into it because there's so many other people who feel the way I feel about the village of Gren, about the people of Gren. And, they believe that, the 110 survivors, they all owe their lives. They all owe their children's lives and their grandchildren's lives to the people of the village of Gren. So it's just an overwhelming experience.
Well, I want to thank you not only for being a participant in our talk tonight, but also for writing the story. It's amazing. This is probably our, I want to say this is probably our 30th book talk since we started doing these virtually, and this is easily the most amazing one, especially your personal involvement. So we thank you very much for that, for writing it, and for being with us.
But above all, thank the paratroopers and thank the villagers.
Yep. So folks, I can't urge you enough to try to read this book as soon as you can, because you will really enjoy it. Thanks to our audience. We had a great participation tonight. We had some great questions from the audience, and we always appreciate your participation.